Hello again. I am Rebecca Staplewax. I'm Executive Director of SOJOURN, the Southern Jewish Resource Network for Gender and Sexual Diversity. We just celebrated our 10th year anniversary, and we are thrilled to have our inaugural Pathways to Progress conversation tonight with Rabbi Joshua Lesser, Reverend Dr. Robert Lowry, and Dr. Danny Rosenkrantz. To introduce each one of them, and then we will have some questions for each of them, and also questions and answers at the end of our time together. If you do have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat. And here we go. Rabbi Josh, and these are in alphabetical order. So just wanted you to know we were very thoughtful about that. Rabbi Joshua Lesser uses he, him pronouns, is a committed leader for justice and mutual understanding. He is Rabbi Emeritus of Congregation Bet Havorim after 22 years of service. He founded SOJOURN as the Rainbow Center in 2001 and co-founded the Faith Alliance of Metro Atlanta, serving as its first Jewish president, and chaired the City of Atlanta's Human Relations Commission. A trained spiritual director, Rabbi Josh currently works on the On Being Project and their Social Justice Fellowship as the spiritual director for the fellows. With his depth of experience, he also works at the Berman Center, an outpatient mental health facility for teens and young adults. He supports the clinicians and therapists in offering spiritual resources and pastoral care for their clients. He also teaches spiritual practice, graded sense of mental wellness. Rabbi Josh's leadership experience and focus on social healing helps his clients and communities advance their purpose, cultivate connection, and deepen communal and personal joy. Reverend Dr. Robert Lowry uses he, him pronouns, passionate about interfaith collaboration, intersectionality, the effects of religious trauma, and addressing systemic oppression. He's dedicated to the inner working of unlearning toxic masculinity and white privilege, and strives to serve a diverse network of people. Pastor Rob has the Jewish community in Mississippi and Arkansas, as well as with the Institute for Southern Jewish Life. And Dr. Danny Rosenkrantz uses she and they pronouns, has worked extensively within the Jewish community, especially serving LGBTQ plus individuals and their family members. She utilizes a collaborative approach in her therapeutic work, empowering clients to take the reins of their healing journeys. They are passionate advocate for the BIPOC and LGBTQ plus communities, using their voice and expertise to fight for the rights of the marginalized. Thank you all so much for being here. I'd love to hear where you all are at this moment, but also where you generally practice your work, and so we'll find out more about you, but that's really important to hear the states in which you work mostly, and so that we get a better understanding of the people in which you are working with. Pastor Rob, we'll start with you.
Well, number one, thank you all for letting me be with you this evening. I serve in Little Rock, Arkansas at Westover Hills Presbyterian Church, which is a community of 4 worshiping congregations. Westover Hills, which is a traditional Presbyterian church. The Table, which is a church made up of families who are coming out of very toxic evangelical communities and are doing their own form of deconstruction and reconstruction. The Central Arkansas Queer Collective, which is a new community that is ecumenical and interfaith, that is housed at our church and is a network of support for the queer community in Little Rock. And also Sister Thea Bowman Ecumenical Catholic Church, which is an ecumenical Catholic congregation with a brilliant female priest who leads them, who worship in our congregation. So I get to work with all different kinds of communities, luckily. Right now, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee at St. Thomas Hospital, where my mother is recovering from a stroke last week, but luckily found a quiet place to be this evening. But I serve in a context of a congregation of congregations in a way that is committed to the work of justice in general, but specifically justice for those who have not experienced justice in our community, specifically reaching people who live by circumstance or by the force of history on the margins of our community, and also those who are seeking to be a part of changing the way that that community is formed. So I'm very fortunate to serve in a context that lets me live into the things I believe very deeply in.
Thank you so much for being here. We're, I know, all wishing your mom well and your family well. Dr. Danny, where are you at and how do you serve?
Yes. So I am coming to you from Tampa, Florida. I am a Florida native. I'm from South Florida, and did a lot of training in Kentucky and then North Carolina, and then came back to Tampa. So I've been living in the South for a long time as a queer human. And in terms of who I serve, my practice is really centered in a lot of ways on the experience of folks in Florida, given the climate that we are in. But I do offer coaching outside and education outside of Florida as well. And that's why I'm here. I love working with organizations like SOJOURN to provide some education about the mental health implications of all of the things we're navigating that we'll get more into. And I am excited. I'm going to be able to expand my therapy work, I think, coming in the new year to be more accessible to like 30 something states, thanks to SciPac, which will include much of the South. So it'll be helpful to be able to expand further. But for right now, therapy is in Florida.
Excellent. We need more therapists to be able to refer to and to understand our people's experiences. How about you, Rabbi Josh?
Well, I'm here in Atlanta, Georgia. And though I have to say that Carmen Sandiego is my role model these days, where I have been traveling all over and trying to show up with my full authentic self wherever I am. And so right now, my work is multifaceted and has many dimensions. Most directly related to tonight's conversation is I work at the Berman Center, which is really an exceptionally caring and committed community that serves a wide swath of people who are struggling with addressing the issues around anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, addiction. I started working with the teens. I've now started working with the adults. It was founded by the Jewish community because understanding that in the South that a lot of these kinds of opportunities are founded by particular viewpoints with Christianity that often creates a limited experience of how religion or spirituality gets integrated into a mental health framework. And this is an organization that really has wanted to address some of the religious trauma that can be experienced and that many of us here in the South have experienced, as well as wanting to ensure that Jewish values and universal values are uplifted. So, for me, it's been very important, even though I represent the Jewish tradition in some ways, that I'm able to effectively address people who are seekers or people who are agnostic or atheist, and really hold up that being spiritual doesn't necessarily need to take on a frame. As you can imagine, a number of our clients are LGBTQ, and so that comes, and a lot of people are in a place of exploring and on that journey. So it has been really an opportunity, and being able to encounter somebody who is a queer clergy person has made a difference. The other area that is just beginning to emerge, similar to an organization like SOJOURN, that was founded by a good acquaintance of mine that I met at the World Congress of LGBT Jewish organizations probably 30 years ago, Louis Perelman. He has founded an organization called Gimel in Mexico City, serving the LGBT Jewish community. And I have, they've been reigniting after the pandemic, where their connection, kind of dwindled a bit. When I spoke at their inaugural event, I'll be returning in December, and it's really clear from a number of vantage points how important it is for there to be an LGBT, rabbinic presence that can offer pastoral care, because of ways that the Jewish community there is not as inclusive as we would hope them to be. And it reminds me of Atlanta 25 years ago when I arrived here. And so because I've seen progress here, I'm able to offer hope for them there. And I try to do that in a culturally sensitive and very gentle way, not wanting to impose, and recognizing that I have a whole lot to understand about that context. But showing up as a compassionate human being crosses cultures in many ways.
When I showed up in Atlanta 30 years ago from Massachusetts, I realized quickly how important it is and was and will always be to listen and ensure that you are that culturally sensitive and really getting to know what people need and want. And that leads me to my next question, which is the legislative issues that we were here to talk about. Which ones are really most prominent in the areas where you are all working and affecting your communities? And has it changed over time since you started doing this work? And I will start with you, Dr. Danny.
Well, Florida is a shining example of what I wish she wasn't. But yes, I mean, the short answer is yes, absolutely. I think I don't think if you asked any provider in doing work with the queer community, what they would have expected January 2023 to feel like, that they would have been able to anticipate what the onslaught of really, really painful legislation has felt like in this the last few years have been a build up to it, I feel like, but just like an immense amount of legislation. I would say the two biggest things I see that are like just sweepingly impacting folks are gender affirming care access, and then a lot of censorship in terms of schools and education. So I see that as like how we create space and inform growth and identity development of tiny humans in our state, and the support we give them as they grow up. And then additionally, what care we allow them to have access to as youth and adults. So that has been very, very challenging as a provider. And also, I think the silver lining I have found is that I think it has forced us as providers to get in community with each other and build community and build like clear networks. So, if I had somebody contact me today, I need a therapist who speaks Spanish for an adolescent who is in the community, and I don't speak Spanish myself, for definitely not for therapy. And so I was like, okay, I have someone I can email. I have a Facebook group I can go to. And I'm like, okay, resourcing. And we found them a resource within a day. So I think, that's where it's, they forced us to organize. And my hope is that will be difficult for them in the future because we are getting more organized. But it's been tough.
We'll get back to how tough it is us as clinicians and spiritual leaders. Pastor Rob, how about for you?
I think the biggest change that I've noted in the last 18 months has been the shift from broad legislation that is aimed at just the continual marginalization of the community to very targeted legislation that is aimed at groups with even less power within. In Arkansas, we had 9 anti-trans bills, for example, in our last legislative session, 8 of them targeted children. And it was a disheartening legislative session for many reasons, that being one of the chief ones. But what was very troubling about it and has really had the greatest impact on my ministry is the level of vitriol is not even quite strong enough a word. The level of absolute hate and degradation that's been aimed at children and teenagers and young adults, and the impact that's having on them, on their families and systems of support. And in my context, Arkansas is a small state. It is a state with a small but robust LGBTQI plus community. And there is not a lot of space in many parts of the state for those kids and their families to have safe environments for them to work through the things that are standing in their paths right now. So one of the things that has chiefly changed for us has been broadening our coalition out of Little Rock and into rural parts of the state, and working to find resources for our families who are living in small Arkansas counties that our legislators assume have no families impacted by their work. But in truth, every legislative district, every small school district, everywhere in the state, someone is suffering under the heel of this legislation. And more often than not, I'm finding that to be kids. And the reality of that is that you're not just talking about that child or adolescent who's being impacted, but the parents who are caring for them, the teachers who are caring for them, the physicians and healthcare workers and mental health professionals, if they can find one in Arkansas, who are caring for them. And the breadth of how far this legislation has done emotional and spiritual damage is frankly much larger than in the past, I think, because of that targeting of that specific population within the state.
It is daunting, to say the least. And when certainly the most vulnerable and most marginalized are attacked and affected and powerless. And so, Rabbi Josh, I'm going to ask you a similar question. And we're sort of talking about the state of the things, and sometimes that it is very difficult. And we will also talk about very hopeful things. And I love that we've already talked about the coalitions that are being created, and thank you for pushing us together. So for you, Rabbi Josh, what are you seeing, and how has time changed things?
Sure. I mean, first, I just want to quickly, reflect on, Rob, what you just shared is that one of the things that I feel, particularly in the Jewish community and beyond, and the LGBT community too, is that the South is time and time again overlooked when the ways we address things, I think, is incredibly resourceful and incredibly resilient. And so the work that you're doing in Arkansas is so incredibly important, and I think often should be uplifted as a model of what determination, resilience, of what community can look like. That's been my experience. Rebecca and I have had the privilege for a long time of going to Louisiana, of going to North Carolina, of going to Alabama, to many of these places. And, time and time again, I see the South as a particularly important model for how community organizing can make a real difference and an impact. So I just wanted to thank you about that. And that to me is what's hopeful. I'll start and say that, kind of with the 25-year outlook, is that it feels like a roller coaster. And the good thing about a roller coaster is that I now know that there is an up, when there is a significant down. I'm using this word very carefully. I know the context in which I'm speaking will make it feel even more challenging. but a particular party's time and time again's decision to use politics targeting the LGBT community in a really specific way, to me, is nothing short of a low-level kind of terrorism. And when I hear the two of you talking about kind of what the effects are and how pervasive these effects are, I've also taught recently at a women's and gender minority college here in Atlanta. And I'm seeing students with a greater sense of anxiety, people having, during this last legislative session, I had a number of queer, trans, non-binary students in my class. And the fact that I made just a little bit of space to talk about it, they reflected back to me how important it was, even though this was an affirming campus and there's a lot of really positive support in this place, the fact that I could acknowledge and create space for them was so necessary. And I have never seen the level of anxiety amongst our our young people and our future leaders. And so I think this is going to have a huge impact. Like Dr. Danny said, I really do feel that the particular assault on the trans and non-binary community, and specifically around youth, has been particularly painful. And so I'm seeing with folks in my other settings, just this deep sense that there is a hatred for their own existence that they don't understand. And so they may not be keyed into the specific bill or legislation, but they are keyed into the volume and the perseverance of a particular worldview that believes they should not exist or that their existence isn't real. And that level of erasure feels incredibly important. And I would say, that is the specific difference. The two roller coasters that I remember are about when the sodomy law got lifted and how important that was in terms of this understanding of being able to not feel that a vital part of our mental health is a healthy sex life. And so that's not criminalized, that our sex isn't criminalized, was incredibly important. And then the next frontier became marriage. And so, while I remember the assaults and what it felt like around marriage, it didn't have the same kind of vitriol, using the word that you used, Pastor Rob, that it seems to have now, and that it's targeted at a much younger generation feels particularly cruel, which is why I go to the sense of terrorism. There's an intentionality that is about dehumanizing and diminishing people's sense of their own existence. And it is why it is so incredibly important for forums like this and for organizations and the work that we're doing in order to uplift people's dignity and to let them know that not only do we affirm them, we celebrate them, we encourage them, and that we can support them on their journey, and that they don't have to know everything just now in order to be able to be held in a safe space to discover who they are, but that their journey in and of itself is a sacred and special one.
Thank you. Dr. Danny, I am wondering if you could address the consequences and benefits of having supportive faith community for one's mental health.
Absolutely. There's a really simple statistic I often like to share in response to this question. It's from the Human Rights Council, and it essentially says that one adult can impact the risk of suicide of someone by 40%. One affirming adult can impact that. And so to me, that is the opportunity that, we have this amazing opportunity to be those adults for folks and it makes me think as well. I was a part of a Keshet training yesterday for Tampa specifically, and we talked about that Jewish value around like, if you save one life, you've saved the world. And so it really is very much, that is the opportunity that we can save the world with each of these lives that we affirm and make feel seen and help them feel like there's a future for them, and that we're a very loud counter message to what you were sharing, Rabbi Josh, like that, yes, there are voices here that say we don't want you to exist. We desperately want you to exist, and we are so glad you are here. There's also a lot of work that the Trevor Project has done in collecting data that they specifically actually were able to pull out some data for Florida. And so some of that data has demonstrated that like another big barrier that's happening is that young people don't have safe places. They don't have safe places in school. They can talk about this. This is very much what you were saying, Rabbi Josh. Like they don't have the same safety in schools to talk about their identity and experiences. They may or may not have safe places at home. The politicization of gender identity has made it so that this feels very unsafe to talk about in many communities. And so us being a beacon of light that says this is a place, it is a very powerful opportunity. So I think that and particularly from like, I think about power, and I think faith traditions have a lot of power in our communities as kind of a voice of morality. That is kind of what they've been, we've been given in these faith communities, as this is where you go to find out what your moral compass is going to be. And so I think in the face of all of this, to be able to say our morality says that you are wonderful and beautiful and holy, and we want to support you, is that is such an opportunity for us that I think makes us holier as well. So that is some of what I think.
And it's so incredibly helpful because we are here to talk with who is in the room, but we're also planning on sharing this with other faith leaders, and for them to know that they are models and that they are giving their congregation, their members, hope that they can see themselves in the future is essential. For you, Pastor Rob, are there scriptures that or pieces of religious text that you use to back up your support for LGBTQ plus people?
Yes and no. The no answer is that I generally don't engage in that debate because I don't find it fruitful. Because I don't know that it is incumbent upon the LGBTQI plus community to defend our existence theologically. Our existence is a reality, and denying that existence doesn't make your argument coherent. So I often just don't engage in the debate with folks. When I am talking about it in a more constructive environment, I lean very heavily on the creation narrative. In the Christian tradition, the question of the holiness of creation was settled in the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, when some early church communities that began to preach that the physical world was inherently evil and only the spiritual was of God. What became the Christian tradition embraced the opposite, which is that all of creation is the work of God's hands. And that is the first thing I tell people when I meet them and we get in this conversation is, you are the creation of God's hands, period. That's the end of the story. You're not the creation of God's hands as long as someone else is okay with it. You're not the creation of God's hands as long as you are that creation in a way that someone likes. You just are. And that value and that worth is inherent. It's not earned. And I think that theologically we have to begin to return to that vocabulary because it moves us beyond the the conversation that I find so incredibly unhelpful, which is to say, if you are on the margins and you want to move from that place, you need to defend somehow your place or your worth. We've done that to non-Euro American North Atlantic populations. We've done that to women. We do that to queer people. And it's just not a coherent theological conversation. So that's where I fall down on it. Now, I am fortunate to be in a theological context where I can begin the conversation there. I have had conversations with my legislators who fancy themselves to be great theological thinkers, and have had to simply let them know that that their perspective is certainly theirs to have, but it's simply not biblical. It's not the story of the God of creation. The story of the God of creation is God made you and God said it's good. End of story.
And I'm sure we would all be interested in how do those legislators respond to that?
Generally not well. Often though, they're surprised to have the conversation with me. I'll be honest. I'm a born and raised Arkansan. I'm 6'4". I'm as broad as a barn, and I drive a big truck. When they see me coming, they think, here comes an ally on our side. And they're a little bit surprised when I arrive and have a somewhat different perspective than theirs. So
Hear that. Rabbi Josh, I'm going to jump to a question about faith communities expressing that they want to support LGBTQ plus community, but are afraid of getting political or alienating their congregation and their members. And what do you say to these leaders, and what advice can you offer them and us around really being an ally?
Sure. If I can quickly just respond a little bit to the textual piece, which is that I used to have a full arsenal of different texts, and there was a time where, like what I heard Pastor Rob say, I was tired of being on somebody else's playing field, and really, and in some ways, this will lead into my answer. I believe Jewishly, we have a relational obligation to one another in terms of humanity. And so, part of this is what I would say to religious communities as well. And so the Torah is very clear about how we are to be in relationship with other people. When we engage with our enemy, we are asked to think about our enemy's overall subsistence and well-being. All of our texts about if an ox goes astray, or if our enemy's oxes, has fallen, we're instructed to help that person, even when, even when it inconveniences us, and particularly even when it's our enemy. And so what it's saying is that we need to provide, that was the source of people's financial existence. And so we need to make sure that people have the very basics of what it is that they need to live. And so I believe that communities need to be responsible to the entirety of the Jewish community and our loved ones who are in there. And I would say that anybody who kind of follows the Bible should do that. And then when we're strangers, or the tradition talks about how we need to have even a closer relationship. And then once again, when we're kin, Isaiah says, just as Isaiah says, don't stand idly by your kin in need, as well as love your fellow human being as yourself. And so, first of all, I want to invite other clergy who are thinking about the perils of stepping in, not to necessarily use these messages with other people, but really to think about how can you embody them. The religious trauma that people are experiencing is real. And so if we don't begin to think that we need a responsibility to address it, particularly in the younger generation growing up. We are at an even greater risk of not having a vital, progressive Jewish community in the future. My experience with teens is I also, like Pastor Rob, don't use texts because they're not even a place where that is wanted or needed. They have already felt profoundly rejected. And so by ignoring the issue or by worrying that being compassionate is being political is to deny a future generation an entry into Jewish participation. And I think it really is grave that way if we don't understand that those really are the terms, that more and more LGBT folks and their friends see religious communities not standing by them. And in doing so, it closes doors. And so I want to encourage that and to be able to find networks to be able to stand on the side of compassion, to be able to navigate and have conversations with donors with really clear values-based conversations about why. And it doesn't even need to be, we approve of LGBT, but, and most of my colleagues do, and here in Atlanta, we are very blessed of having many, many clergy who are welcome, but throughout the South, there is some moral courage that is called upon, but I believe it is not just to be kind to the LGBT community. It really is a stake for the Jewish future.
And as you're talking about compassion and really building community, strengthening community, regardless of your relationship with somebody, it makes me think a lot about what is happening in this war in Israel and Gaza. And so I want to talk a little bit about how that's impacting the people that you're seeing. And because I think many people are feeling isolated. You can't say certain words, have certain feelings. You can't be who you are. And there's so many layers to those identities, Jewish, queer, whether you have family, other aspects of who you are and how you care about humans. And so, Dr. Danny, if you don't mind sharing a bit about what you're seeing.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot in the past month. I think that the experience of being queer folks and being Jewish folks, potentially in addition to other marginalized identities, it really is a really strong example of what holding multiple minority statuses does to your mental health and wellness. And quite simply, I think we're all living through an active trauma experience, and many of us are having trauma responses. I think many folks are grieving very deeply for the loss of life, period. And I think one of the things I've noticed the most in conversations with Jewish LGBTQ plus folks that I've talked to is this deep anxiety about rejection coming from multiple sides, feeling like not fully sure if they can be themselves in queer community or in Jewish community, feeling like they go to a space for Shabbat and it is very strongly aligned in a way that doesn't feel like they can be their authentic selves and have permission to exist with their complicated perspectives or nuanced feelings, or just many feelings that I think many folks have. I've also noticed that isolation piece you mentioned. I think I've had many conversations where people say, I feel like I'm the only one. And I say, I've talked to literally so many people who have said the exact same thing. So much so that I've actually been thinking about maybe trying to find funding for a support group specifically for this intersection, because I think in this particular moment it's just a lot of pain um and deep loss, but it's not just the loss of what's happening and the lack of certainty and disruption of kind of our relationships amongst people that we know, amongst our connection to Israel or Palestine. Like, all of those things are big, big conversations, and it's all happening at the same time as there's also this, like, where do I fit in community? And as the chat is talking about, and as both of you have talked about, community is so foundational to our survival, I think, as queer folks. And so that threat of loss is, I think, evoking a lot of anxiety for many, many folks. I try to, like, help folks think about the ways in which we've kind of described that there can be this kind of, like, you have to use these words, or this kind of very specific thinking and responses. It, to me, is also a trauma response. So thinking about, like, we're all responding to this in different ways, and for some folks their trauma reaction is this very specific thinking, and for some of us it's being flooded by lots of feelings, and that there's no like one truth about how we're supposed to respond in a moment like this. And I think, especially as leaders, it's like, you mentioned the young leaders, how do we support the young leaders? I think we don't have a blueprint for how to navigate a moment like this necessarily. So I think we're all kind of learning together, like, what does it look like to live our values as LGBTQ plus religious Jewish folks, and how do we find community around it? How do we build community around it? How do we figure out how to support the spaces that we have, because our community needs space, while also thinking about the impact of donors and all of these different complex things that I feel like I've had so many conversations about in the last month. The fear of loss of space, and we clearly need space. We're here because of the space that Sojourn holds for us. So those are some of the things that are coming to my mind that I'm seeing, and I'm very grateful to hear and encouraged about the work that both of you are doing to create different experiences for young folks.
Something that's come up in my mind, and because a lot of this legislation is actually attacking practitioners, and I think spiritual leaders have, excuse me, have always had this precarious experience. Excuse me. I would wonder for you, Rabbi Josh, about, do you ever fear for yourself because you can't provide for others?
You know, it's interesting. I would say that particularly during this, I have two kind of conflicting thoughts. The first thought is that I'm really grateful. You know, sometimes I don't always think it's fair in the larger sense, but so many of us as clergy are given different kinds of permission in order to, in terms of how we operate, because of the separation of church and state. So I often try to use that to the greatest benefit as possible for as long as it exists. And so that's one piece of it. And I would say that a long time ago, it used to come from a place of bravado. I think that I was like, I'm taking this on when I was in my 20s, first starting this work, and I was like, bring it on in that kind of way, to a different place in my life where, you know, I have had frank conversations with my family. I am not so concerned about the legislative piece. I am concerned about the violence piece, and that, you know, just to be frank, as anti-Semitism has grown and anti-LGBT sentiment, I am somebody who is worried, and have had parents who have worried for my safety. And I have had conversations with my parents, making it very clear that I choose to do this work at my own risk, and that they should know, God forbid, that if something were to happen in the course of my work, I was, they should know that I was willfully choosing to carry out what my values were. And this is long before things like Tree of Life. It really has been a reality. Being a small resource, rabbi of a small resource congregation that didn't have security much longer than most of our other communities for a whole variety of reasons, that all synagogues have grappled with how security changes the nature of a welcoming community. I wanted to stand as long as possible in order to be able to do that. And then in this moment, like a different kind of social challenge is I have really, as somebody who has been as political as I am, and as someone who does have political beliefs about what is happening in Israel and Gaza, I have largely kept my posts or my actions invisible. Like I'm taking my personal actions, I am supporting what I believe is my right path, with the caveat of saying I'm somebody who is doing deep discernment and trying to figure that out. But I've kind of kept more of a blank slate because I have felt that the people who are safe to meet people wherever they are at are fewer and far between. And so I've had friends in Israel who have read me the Riot Act for what they feel is a perception of my lack of support. And I have had to share with them that social media is only one tool, and that they can trust or not that I am operating in ways that have been in alignment with the values that they have always seen my values to be. But I have been able to be a safe person for rabbis to talk to, for executive directors to talk to, and for people all along the spectrum, particularly the vast amount of Jews and others who don't have the full, and I don't have the full education on the issue as somebody who has studied this. But and so what I have wanted to do is publicly be a pastoral presence at such an important time from a mental health perspective rather than a political presence. And I think that clergy often need to make this choice because sometimes we sacrifice the pastoral when it comes to the political. And so when it's come to the LGBT rights place, I have felt it's very important. And some people would call me hypocritical, either, as my friends in Israel and probably my friends who are, supporters of Palestinians' lives. Both of them probably feel the absence of my voice. And I really feel that at this moment, the best help that I can offer is to be a listening place and a place of discernment for people to sit with. The last thing I want to offer is that we as human beings, when war happens, it often takes us to a place of nationalistic consciousness. And so we get into this tribal place. We get into this place where Dr. Danny is saying there are certain words that are the key words of whatever our tribe is, that there are certain right actions or right things to say, that a strong, what part of the national consciousness level of our consciousness is about binaries. And solutions to war tend to come from the universal place. And what happens for many of us is that we bounce back and forth given whatever image or whatever, it is seen. And sometimes it's hard to know where we can land. And so being a safe place for people to listen and discern for their right action, rather than for it to be reactionary, can be really helpful and supportive in this moment. And that's what I hope to offer, because it's so sparse.
Thank you for holding that space.
Rebecca, if I can just to piggyback, if I may, just for a moment, and say, I think that from my place within the Christian community, one of the things that I've begun to realize the last few weeks, especially, is that in many ways, my role as a community member, as a community leader, as a religious leader, but as a Christian religious leader in this moment, is much like the role that I have been taught by my colleagues and friends to play as a white leader in some of the the more urgent matters of racial reconciliation in our community. I think for many years, white Christian leaders felt the need to stand in front of our colleagues of color, when in reality, our job is to stand beside and to be guided by the wisdom of the communities that we seek to be allies with. I've been very fortunate to have Rabbi Joseph Rosen in Jackson and Barry Block in Little Rock, who are both just fantastic spiritual leaders, be my conversation partner in this particular conversation for the last several years. And one of the things that Barry has done as a rabbi in Little Rock is be very intentional about reaching out to us and letting us know where we can be of most support to his community of faith and to him as a rabbi and as a leader. I think that one of the things that Rabbi Josh mentioned is that in these moments, we all have different, there's different calculus to how we manage the risk. It's one thing for me as a queer man in the South. It's another thing as a religious leader. But in these moments, I'm always reminded there's a line from Dietrich Bonhoeffer's spiritual autobiography that he said, when Christ bids a man, he bids him come and die. That part of our commitment to the gospel as Christians is a commitment to its costs, as well as to its bumper stickers and Christmas carols and all of that. And part of this moment, I think, for some of us is recognizing that part of our call is to community. It is to partnership and conversation, and into what can be very unsafe spaces for conversation that involves nuance and that does not fall into the trap of those binaries. But I just want to express from within the Christian community, the great gift that some of the leaders of the Jewish community have been in helping me and many of my colleagues learn how best to be present in this moment, because it's a complicated thing in the South, especially in our culture right now, but in the last few weeks, even increasingly so. And that wisdom and that community has been of incredible value, and I think it's something that translates into other parts of the work that we do.
Yeah, some of these lessons can be universally used, for sure. I'm going to invite the folks that are in the room to ask a question to the panel. You can unmute, you can put it in the chat, you can sign, you can do it, whatever it is. I have zillions of more questions, but we only have a few more minutes together.
Rebecca, I believe Elaine put a question in the chat
Okay.
earlier. What is the conversation needed about close family responsibilities and legislation that denies parents from doing their best for their trans kids?
So which one of you would like to take that one?
Just wondering if Elaine, if you might be open to sharing a little bit more about your question.
Yeah, it's just that you talked earlier about sort of almost a human rights issue, and I'm reminded of a talk I went to that a leading indicator of genocide is when families get attacked. We saw it in Israel. We're actually seeing it in a weird way with the Hamas not supporting families, using families. And so, yeah, we've got legislators attacking families. I mean, doing that, they are sort of destabilizing sort of LGBT communities. And what's the conversation we have? That's where I was coming from for that one.
I just want to say really quickly, what I have found to be really effective is to actually accompany families and invite them to do the speaking. but to be there present with them, to be able to tell their stories directly, and to make legislators see that these are real people who are caring parents. They are not the monsters. They are not the crazy devil people that they often use in terms of their rhetoric. And so I've often just felt that humanity and repeated humanity, and so the parents here in this area are incredibly brave and incredibly powerful. And so as we as clergy, if we can support them in telling their stories, that to me is the best. And then if we can follow up so that they don't necessarily have to be face to face with all of the vitriol, I think that's how we can do a more protective role. We can play a more protective role.
Pastor Rob or Dr. Danny, do you want to say anything more?
Only I think I would add to that that part of the equation is walking with the entire family and understanding that much of the support that is needed in this context is beyond the identified individual who might be the parishioner or the client or whatever the case may be. There's that entire network around, as the question indicates, is being targeted, and so that support has to have tendrils that go in multiple directions.
The piece that I guess I've been holding on to as you were both sharing is, as someone who lives in Florida, where I don't feel a ton of confidence in the ability to persuade my legislators at all times. I think something that's really felt very real for us here is organizing around future candidates, really organizing voting so that we're instilling hope that change is possible. I also try to really remind folks that, like, even in a place like Florida, like, I think Florida has quite the reputation. A friend of mine that flew here immediately started getting like Florida man recommendations on his stories on his news feed. We have quite a reputation. And I think, the race that resulted in my current governor being in that seat was a very close race. It was not a landslide. It was a race that indicates that there are many people, even in a place like Florida, that had a vision of a different future. And that if given the support and resources and hopefulness and strategy, that we could fight for that future to still be real. And I think figuring out, how to get in community with other folks organizing is a big piece of that. I know here Equality Florida is a really big resource, and they host tons of webinars helping families navigate how to do advocacy in the schools or at legislative meetings. Like, you don't have to invent the wheel. There are people that are putting effort into building an infrastructure that you can join into, which also I think can be heartening to just like not feel alone and to feel in community, because this work is a marathon. It is not a sprint. So those are some of the things that are coming to my mind.
Much Elaine for that question. I think that's really why we're here, and it's so important. This week we saw a lot of political change and legislation and voter activity, and that was hopeful. And I want to remind everybody that there's the Thrive Coalition that Sojourn co-leads with Keshet, which is 230 Jewish organizations across the country that are working to protect and defend trans youth. And I'm going to put the way to reach in the chat. And being in community is really key. That's why we're here. That's why we're talking. That's why we're sharing. And that's why we're asking questions and we're showing up. And so we want to end our time together by saying thank you for showing up, being here, doing whatever you can, however you can, whenever you can. And thank you to our panelists, Pastor Rob, Dr. Danny, Rabbi Josh, and everybody that was here. Please take good care and stay in touch.
Thank you, Rebecca.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, Rose. It's great to be with you, Dr. Danny and Pastor Rob.
Same.